You're listening to episode 211 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Beres joins us to speak about his book, The Warrior's Path, Living Yoga's 10 Codes. Buddhism is not the only tradition that involves being in the present, in full awareness, and making more skillful decisions. It's also not the only tradition undergoing growing pains as it encounters modernity, particularly Western culture, and that involves questioning many of the assertions common in the very language we use. Yoga is also seeing its own period of enlightenment, as it honors the ethical framework that still applies in society. Beres has devoted his life to exposing people to international music, yoga, mythology, and global cultures as a means of creating better individuals and a more informed society. He is the creator of Flow Play, an innovative vinyasa-based class that fuses yoga, music, and neuroscience, offered nationally at Equinox Fitness. He has published 7 books, including The Warrior's Path, Living Yoga's 10 Codes, and Global Beat Fusion, The History of the Future of Music, and has contributed to dozens of magazines and websites regarding the traditional and digital realms of global music, religion, yoga, and health, including Women's Health, Yoga Journal, National Geographic, Rolling Stone Middle East, Departures, AOL, and MTV. He worked as the managing editor of Global Rhythm magazine and currently writes a weekly column for Big Think, 21st Century Spirituality. So sit back, relax, and have a nice amber light ale. And our guest today is Derek Beres. Derek, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Ted. Thanks for having me.
Very glad to be speaking with you. So let's start by having you tell us about your background. It's 2 main threads that we're interested in here, which is yoga and neuroscience. How did each of those start and come together?
Okay, I guess the origin point, in a sense, would be my first week of college in 1993. I went to Rutgers University, and I met someone via my new roommate who ended up crashing in our room quite often because he was a commuter, and he had copies of the Dhammapada and the Bhagavad Gita and handed it to me. And I'll never forget looking me in the eye and saying, "Are you ready for your life to change?" That same month, I had met someone over the summer that I became friends with, and he introduced me to marijuana. I had grown up basically agnostic, no religion, and I had grown up playing sports. So my whole life was just more athletic based, and also with the fascination of comic books and mythologies and stories and things like that. In college, I started off as a business major, which switched very quickly to English. And then that first year, just as it happened, I was introduced to things like psychedelic mushrooms and LSD and things of those nature. And I started taking religion classes because I was reading these texts my friends were giving me. And all of those things kind of worked together. So for the next 4 years, they were just pretty much a part of my education in many different ways. So I had some background in the texts, and I was doing some dance classes and some martial arts. And I remember I started taking this one particular class. This is about 2 years after college now. I started taking this class that was a combination of yoga, ballet, and modern dance. And the yoga portion was just, it's called Alan Wayne work specifically. And the yoga portion was more of a warming up of the body before you got into the modern dance aspect. So it was very creative. And one of my first classes, if not the first, I remember we were doing a stretch on the floor. It was sort of a repetitive hip movement. And as I was doing it and felt the feeling in my leg, and I had broken my right leg 3 times throughout my youth, so I've had a number of injuries. I remember feeling I had absolutely no knowledge of certain parts of my body. There were muscles that I just didn't know existed or that I could use them. And that because I didn't use them, they were actually affecting the rest of my body. And it was right then that I decided I was going to start yoga and dedicate my life to it. And I started taking classes. The body awareness that came along with it showed me so much about all of the texts I had been reading. So you can get very caught in your head with these texts, but there's a sort of embodiment that has to happen with the philosophies as well. It was at that point that I really became aware of that. That was in 1999 that I really decided that I was going to dedicate my life to yoga and pursuing all aspects of it.
How did that progress then? You'd had some experience with it. You'd been discovering now there is something to knowing this fathom long body. And I need to learn about myself and how we work. So where did that take you?
At the time, I was working as a journalist for a number of years, very physically active, but I really didn't like the fact that I had to be in an office for 40 or 45 hours a week, depending on which job I was at the time. When in all of those employments, I usually got the job done in a lot less time. And always sitting down is not the best thing for your body, first of all. So I was doing these yoga practices in the evening and sometimes in the morning. All day I was sitting. My body just didn't feel good. My last job was as an editor of a world music magazine. And after 2.5 years, I got fired because I was writing for other publications. But if you know anything about journalism, it's hard to make a living writing for one. And it was a blessing. And I knew it was going to be when it happened. So for a while, I was making my money DJing, but this is just when I was going through my teacher training program with yoga. I was hired shortly thereafter by an organization called Equinox Fitness, which is national and international now, actually. So this was 10 years ago. At that time, I just realized how lucky I was that I was able to make a living by having people move. It was also at the time around then that it really put together all aspects of my life, though. So you have a classroom and you're expected to move people, but there are many ways you can move people. You can move people physically, but you also move them emotionally, you move them mentally. Having been a DJ for a few years at this point and having been a music journalist and a lifelong lover of music, it gave me a place to play all of this great world music, because that's been my specialty for a long time, is Indian music, African, Middle Eastern music. It gave me a place to play it for people. And as a journalist, it's great to introduce people to music they might not have heard of, but there's something much different from reading about music and listening to it. When you're listening to the music and the context of moving your body and getting your endorphins going and getting your oxytocin, your dopamine, everything is starting to move as you're exercising and you're hearing this music you never heard before, it really creates a complete environment. And the final piece of that is the mythologies and the stories. So being able to tie the entire class experience in through the story, the music, and the movement, it became my passion. You had asked specifically about the neuroscience, though, and my favorite aspect of yoga has always been jnana yoga, or the yoga, the philosophy of yoga. So traditionally, there are a number of yogas. There's bhakti yoga, raja yoga, and jnana yoga is always been where a lot of the texts come from. It's the philosophical aspects. And the one thing about that is there's a term called viveka. which means discernment. As yoga has become more and more popular in the United States, I saw a lot of emphasis on the postures and on people showing off the postures, and very little emphasis on viveka, which is critical thinking. And so as I kept getting deeper and deeper into the practice, I found myself reading less and less of the old texts and more about what would be considered the seat of our knowledge. So if the practice of yoga is all about self-realization, and we know that the brain is what creates the sense of self, then it made sense to me to study the brain instead of going back thousands of years and trying to talk about this God or that God or things like that. All of this is the product of brain chemistry and environment and who we deal with and how we deal with things and things of that nature. But that was when my fascination, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, with neuroscience really came into play. Ramachandran's book, The Telltale Brain, was one of the early ones that I read. It just blew my head open in a number of ways to see how many things were so similar to some of the old ideas of yoga, and yet if you study neuroscience, some of it is so counterintuitive. It's so not what we think. It was in that space that inspired me to write this book, to talk about some of the things that are counterintuitive, so that hopefully as a community and people who practice yoga, we can change the dialogue to fit what we know now instead of always looking back on things.
So this is your seventh book, and the other that might be of particular interest to the listeners of this podcast would be Sound Against Flame, The Process of Yoga and Atheism in America. You're in a familiar position for secular Buddhists in that you're an out atheist with what many people would call a spiritual practice. How do you describe what that means, how that works to people who are kind of foreign to the concepts?
One of the main focuses of my career, especially over the last year, but I've been developing for 2 years, is a program called Flow Play, which I launched nationally at Equinox Fitness. And it's the intersection of yoga, music, and neuroscience. And it's a group fitness class, but there's a training that goes with it. As I was doing the trainings, and we trained over 150 instructors nationally, and then we held public workshops and probably saw, and I say we, Philip Steer is my partner in this project, probably 300 to 400 people in our workshops. And they were marketed and promoted as really being about the music and the neuroscience. But what really amazed me is every city that we went to, the thing that people asked the most about and they got the most from was when we were talking about the neuroscience of emotions and how we can use music to affect our emotions. So in Flow Play, part of every class is meditation, and you're meditating specifically to music. And music affects your brain differently depending on the chords and the keys and the rhythms and all of these things. And what it made me realize is that everyone wants to know, if they get angry, how can they deal with that? If they get sad, how can they deal with that in a way that's going to help them and not be a hindrance and not weigh them down for months or years or get caught in these repetitive cycles, samsara. In yoga, they're the samskaras, which are this sort of the neural patterns that we get caught in. I don't think that we need a concept of any sort of divine overseer to be able to deal with our emotions. And when we're talking about a spiritual experience, we're talking about, in the Buddhist practice, it's just finding this bliss spot. That's Ananda in yoga, but the ecstasy that comes. And it's not this everything is great all the time feeling, but it's this feeling that regardless of what is going on around you, you feel okay and centered, and you're able to use your emotions without being used by them. I don't think that there can be anything more spiritual than being in control of your emotions. Because if you can be in that space of calm and centered, no matter what's going on, and really feel and work through the sadness and the anger when it comes through and use it for something good. In the program, and I mentioned this in the book briefly, anger, actually, when you express anger, it lowers levels of cortisol in your blood. So people around the world can get angry at different things, but anger itself as an emotion is very clear to understand. It's a rise in cortisol. if you're using a mechanism to help you to release that cortisol and lower the levels, that's going to be good. You can then create something. And in the book, in the program, we talk about protest music and how when you're angry socially at something and you hear a song that backs up your feelings, not only is it releasing the pleasurable hormones that you want in your brain by hearing the music, but it's also lowering those levels of cortisol because it's sort of a direct and focused anger. I sometimes use the idea of the warrior series in yoga, the warrior 1, 2, and 3, which physically mimics the drawing of the arrow and the shooting of the bow. So you have a warrior ideology from a warrior culture, but you're using it to direct your emotional senses too. Because very much when I started yoga, I was very much on board with we were created for a reason. There's always a reason for everything. And as you start to apply that viveka, or the discernment, to these philosophies, you see they just don't stand up to reality. And so how can we still have a spiritual, or what we call a spiritual experience, which I think is just sort of an emotional homeostasis, just being able to balance your emotions and keep your attention and focus without the need of any sort of divine presence. And I think it's very easy to do.
So let's talk about the warrior's path. This book itself, what prompted you to write it?
Well, two things. There's an intense focus on postures and especially inversions in yoga. So there are yoga teachers or practitioners who are on Instagram who have hundreds of thousands and millions of followers because all they do every day is they post a photo of themselves doing a handstand. And good for them, but their main argument, because I've written articles about it, there's been some dialoguing between some of the people who practice it, is, well, we like to look at our alignment. And I always come back with, well, if you're looking at your alignment, why do you need to post it publicly?
Yeah. Why does that have to be a look at me kind of discussion?
Yes, and it's very much that. And they say, well, it inspires people to do that. And I really think it detracts from a core element of yoga. Patanjali, when he compiled the Yoga Sutras, so he took from 6 various schools of yoga that were going on, predominantly Samkhya, and compiled this book that is sort of the basis of what we know of as yoga. And he had his sort of eightfold path, similar to the Buddha. But the first two were the yamas and the niyamas, the ethical focus and the moral restraints. And the third was asana, which is posture, which is what I was just talking about. Very few people, even people who've gone through teacher training, know about the yamas and niyamas. They go to the postures first. Traditionally, a teacher would not accept a student who were not practicing their ethics, because if you were out stealing from people, or if you were being violent, or if you weren't being truthful, if you were lying, if you were sleeping with your friend's wife, if all of these things were happening, the teacher would say, how are you going to understand higher consciousness? You're not even doing this right. So there's no way you're going to sit here and meditate and be able to understand these higher elements of compassion and empathy and altruism and those things if you're cheating people. And we just don't even look at that as a part of yoga. That's a generalization. Yes, there are many people that do, but what gets promoted as yoga in many ways just doesn't even address that. So there's that element. And the other element is just the misperception, this sort of yoga getting combined with the book, The Secret, this idea that your thoughts can change reality.
Magically change things. If you just think about it, it'll be there. And it took a lot of creative editing when they made that documentary. I'm doing quotey fingers in the air.
Oh, yeah. And so Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a wonderful book called Bright Sided, which just actually looked at the neural mechanisms of what thoughts are and showing how you talk about energy. Well, energy is something we can actually measure. It's not some mystical thing. We can measure energy, and a thought cannot change. A neuron firing does not leave anywhere beyond that synapse. It doesn't go anywhere. But you say these things, and then people who are invested in that ideology will say, oh, you're just being negative. One of the fascinating things I found out doing the research for this book is that in his time, Buddha was criticized by their teachers because I guess there was this idea that in Sanskrit, it was considered bad practice to talk negatively, to use the words with A's, because in Sanskrit, like himsa means violence, ahimsa means nonviolence. So talking negatively about situations was considered bad form. But he recognized that you couldn't always talk about things in positive with positive attributes. You had to be critical. And that is still happening all these years later. That is still going on, where people think that you just overlook an issue, or you just, everything has a reason. That was the main reason I wrote this book, because people think everything has a reason. So it's like when something happens, and I said, you can only always say that in hindsight.
Right. Right. Can you give us a few highlights of the 10 codes and what you mean by living them?
I think I write this in the book, but I don't believe you can be born into a religion if you have a religious practice, because it's a practice. It's exactly that. And because your parents had this faith, if you're born but you're not practicing what that faith requires of you, then how can you really say that that's your practice? It's a practice. It's not a perfection. So that's why the idea of, Joseph Campbell writes about it in The Inner Reaches of Outer Space, where he talks about this idea of a holy land. Any land can be holy. It depends on your perception. But this idea that a person is chosen just by being born is ludicrous. And it served a certain tribal function for a long time, but we're kind of past that. So to live a practice is really what you need to do if you want to consider it your discipline. So like I was just saying a few minutes ago, traditionally a teacher would not accept a student if they were, ahimsa is probably the most well-known of these codes. That's very talked about. If you're being violent, then what is your yoga there? What is it doing? So what I wanted to do in the book is explore some of the connotations, because you could be violent to yourself. You can be violent outwardly. You can be violent to people. You can be violent, I read about, to animals and the way that we abuse animals, and not really understanding that most mammals have very similar emotional systems as we do, and basically in their own way want to experience what humans experience. That was the basis of living them. And I think ahimsa is an important one. And it's also, there's something about paying attention that is very relevant to the conversation, because you have to really, one of the codes is called svadhyaya, and it's self-study, and it's meditation, it's internal reflection. But to be able to really do that, you have to be present with what you're going through all the time. And I'm not a technophobe in any way. My father was a computer programmer since the 1960s. We had one of the first laptops ever in the 1980s in my house. I've been around computers for a long time, and I design websites. I do a number of things, so I'm always plugged in. But it's that incessant sort of always needing to check your phone, always looking down. It's like if you're in line, you just go somewhere and people are in line, they can't not be looking at something instead of looking around what's going on around them at the time.
Yeah, those are great examples that I use for my mindfulness students of taking opportunities throughout the day that exist to arrive, to just be present with yourself, with your situation, and I don't mean yourself in a selfing way and reinforcing this conceptualized, ossified idea of the self. I mean, just being present with the experience and what's going on, observing your body, your heart space, your emotional state, your mind, and what's going on. Doing that exactly as you're saying, you have so many opportunities throughout the day that we just pass by because we're not used to even noticing, even remembering sati, remembering that they're there.
And I live in Los Angeles now, and it amazes me. I'll be on the 405 doing 75, 80 miles an hour, and next to the car will pass me doing that, and their forearms are on the wheel as they're driving that fast, and their phone is in their hands. And it's frightening. And this is one of the chapters specifically talks about this, is that there's 100,000 accidents a year in the United States, and that number is going up because of texting and driving. 400,000 people at the moment worldwide are either injured or killed because of distracted driving, because people not paying attention. We're literally killing ourselves and other people in the process because we can't be present at that moment. There's so much going on when you're driving a car. I didn't have a car for 12 years. I was in New York for a long time. I moved here 3 years ago, and I was just back there a week ago to teach. And people on the sidewalk, completely oblivious. There's cranes overhead, there's cars flying by, there's taxis almost on the sidewalk, and people are crossing streets not looking once, texting on their phone. And it's one of those things, and you don't want to sound cruel, but when something happens, who are you going to blame?
So, Derek, what are some of the common unscientific misperceptions about yoga that you've run into?
Well, the biggest one is that you can be a yoga instructor and be atheist. I've had people challenge me on that. Not often. Atheism specifically isn't something I talk about in my classes, but I write about it, obviously. And this perception that yoga has to be this. And when you try to tell someone that there's not too much of a difference between what they're saying and between what fundamentalist Christians are saying, who are trying to overturn same sex marriage or deny rights or things like that, are not that different from what militant Islamists are saying. Yes, it might not be as dangerous, but the idea that your specific take on this is the take. I remember I had one person and his wife's family he went to visit, and they're Russian. Her uncle had practiced yoga in Russia in the 1950s and 60s and swore that that was the only true yoga that ever existed. That was it. If you didn't do it then, you're never really going to know what yoga is about. You know, we get very invested with what we want to believe. In Los Angeles, Kundalini yoga is big here. It's a smaller part of the overall population, but it's kind of one of the meccas for Kundalini. And it just so happens that a lot of addicts turn to Kundalini. And wonderful that they're getting over their drug abuse, but they then apply the same mindset to the yoga. So the yoga becomes the addiction. That is one of the biggest misperceptions. And it's thinking that this way is the way. And it's unfortunate. And again, I think we're at a place, I feel very excited that in a sense, we're still in the very infant stages of neuroscience. fMRI technology, I'm sure in a decade is we're going to have something that just really blows that away. But the fact that we can understand some things about our brain that like 2 decades ago wasn't available can show us what stands up, like what concept stands up. I think that the Buddha had it right. All life is dukkha. All life is unsatisfactory when you're looking at it from a certain perspective. I think that has stood up for a very long time. But I use this example in my training. I'm on a couple of different schools. I teach the philosophy aspect of yoga. And some people I'll ask, do you believe that everything happens for a reason? And some people will say yes. And one example I'll use is the typhoon that hit the Philippines a year ago or 2 years ago. I forget now. Something like 5,000 people died. And I said, well, what was the reason for 5,000 people dying? And I've actually had people say, well, it teaches the rest of the world about climate change. And I say, okay, so if the mother of a baby and the mother survived and the baby didn't, if she was here right now, you would look her in the eyes and you think that it would be a good idea to tell her that.
Yeah, thanks for the lesson. Where's the compassion in that?
Exactly. That's when that switch can happen in their brain. When you take an idea or a concept and you put it up against a real life situation, is it going to stand up? And those theories, they don't. They simply don't.
You briefly touched on Gautama, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about the relationship between Buddhism and yoga, because there's a little more there than I think many people may be aware of. Tell us a little bit about that.
From my research, and Karen Armstrong touches upon this both in The Axial Age and in her biography of Buddha, and Mark Epstein also talks a bit about this in The Trauma of Everyday Life, that Buddha had studied yoga for a number of years before he devised his own system. And there's also, not to diverge too far, but there's also some ideas that martial arts grew out of yoga too. So at the time, you had many different ideas of yoga. There were, again, many schools of it, but it was a very fertile time in this meditative practice. And traditionally, asanas, there were 8 or 10 of them. You just did some stretches before you sat for many hours, so your body was limber. And the Buddha had practiced yoga, I've read 6 years, it could have been longer. And he had two teachers. Basically, they had this idea that if you studied under us, at some point through us, you will be enlightened. That was where he finally broke off because he said, okay, you cannot give this to me. In India, I don't know when it started, but it does exist now. It's called Shakti Put. And this idea that an enlightened teacher can come and touch you and then give you some of his enlightenment. Like that still exists. So I think it was sort of maybe a version of that by, just being in the presence of that person that they'll lift you up and eventually you'll be there. And Gautama had a problem with that. And he said, no, that's not it. That's not it. Because he tried it for a long time and he never felt satisfied with that. And as the mythology goes, he went and he sat and wouldn't move until he came to terms with what he was dealing with. But at his time, I mean, that was one of the main philosophical systems and meditation practices being used in India. So he would keep running into it. And I think that there's just a lot of crossover. You're dealing with he had his eightfold noble path. We have the yamas and the yamas. There's this correlation between how you act and how you think. And if those two things are lined up, then you maintain that presence you were just talking about. But if you say this one thing, but you're acting completely differently, then it's never going to line up and it's never going to make sense. And you went briefly into it, and I think Sam Harris does a wonderful job in Waking Up in his new book about going into the idea of the no self. But when you start deconstructing the layers of the self and looking for it, and you see how it really isn't there, or how hard it is to find, or how to have any sense of solidity, it really changes your perspective. And I think there's some fear that goes along with that. I really think we're not dealing with many different problems in terms of coming to grips with being this animal on this planet and how do we get here and all these things we're wondering, and people getting very invested in their sense of self. I find it very similar today, some of the issues that I'm writing about that Buddha was going through in his own times with the yoga practitioners around him.
Yeah, the sense of self is one of the hardest things to deal with. It is one of the most challenging in the tradition. And I'm always a little bit nonplussed by accusations that we get about being scientific materialists or reductionists. And I point out Buddha reduced us to heaps. So you're in a practice which is already based in materialism. So let's not go there. I also wanted to give you, just to wrap it up, you had mentioned flow play, and I wanted to give you a couple minutes just to talk about that and describe what that is for the listeners.
When I was hired at Equinox, it was 10 years ago next month. The woman who hired me, she took my class and she saw the way that I move. So my particular class is vinyasa, which is very broad in terms of yoga. Vinyasa means linking breath to breath. So you link the poses together through the breath. But within that, there's such a variety of ways you can do that. And she had noticed that I'd come from a dance background. And so there's a lot of very flowing movements. And the music, we've just stayed in touch for so long. And then she saw a couple of years ago, I was starting some workshops with my friend Philip. And what I noticed in classes is that teachers play the wrong music at the wrong time. It's not even to say I don't like the music, because personal preference does come into it, but we would be in a flow portion where our heart rate is increasing, but they would be playing sitar music. And sitar music, there was a study done at the University of Berlin that showed that sitar specifically lower levels of cortisol. So the music is telling my nervous system to calm down, but you're telling me to speed up. I would be in classes where we'd be in Shavasana, the final resting posture, and there would be a beat on in the song. Beats increase your heart rate. They help oxygenate your lungs. They increase your pain threshold. A couple of years ago, the marathon board in New York made music illegal for professional marathon runners because it was considered a performance enhancement drug. And your brain, when it hears a beat, there's a process, it's called entrainment. We're always waiting for the fourth beat, or whatever the beat cycle happens to be. But in America, we're very accustomed to the 4-4 cycle. So when that fourth beat is about to hit, our brain in anticipation is releasing dopamine. So it's preparing for that beat. And then it gets that little rush when it happens. So if you're in a posture where you're trying to physiologically calm everyone to the point of almost being in a trance. And you're telling my brain to like be active, there's a misfire. So we created this program to teach teachers. I'm also a DJ and a music producer, and Philip is a longtime music producer. And we're both fascinated by how music affects your brain. So we did the training to teach teachers how to use music better. And within that, we have a musical meditation. So in every class, whatever theme we develop for the month, and it goes out nationally, teachers pick music that fits along with the theme to meditate to as well. So you present the concept, and then you're looking for appropriate music that fits the concept. It's why film composers get paid so much money, because you can match an emotion with an instrument. Nothing utilizes as many regions of your brain at once as music. And yet it's the only thing from an evolutionary perspective that it doesn't have a purpose. Sex comes from procreation, food just to sustain, shelter to sustain. Music is the only thing that is pervasive throughout every culture ever, affects more regions of our brain than anything, and yet has no purpose, but yet it's the common language that everyone can share in. And so we developed the class from my friend who hired me, had the idea of making it a group fitness format to really celebrate music and to try to use music as a performance enhancement drug. A lot of times teachers in yoga, the practice, they'll be a little scared. They'll use the same music for months at a time. They won't know how to sequence it. Like I said, you'll be doing one thing and another. So that was what the program was about, trying to get them to sync it, to make it a complete experience instead of just here's music here, here's movement. They don't have anything to do with each other.
It's interesting. You and our friend Julian Mark Walker also uses music in his yoga classes, and I think for the same reasons, because this can really promote the experience and what it is that you're doing in the class.
Yes, Julian lives about 3 blocks from me. We have a website together called Yoga Brains, where we write about, we need to update it more. We haven't been doing as many pieces, but where we tackle some of the topics we've been talking about this evening. And his class is fantastic. And his Sunday morning class, he calls it Yoga Church, because it's a cathartic experience. He's a fantastic teacher, and the music goes very much, and he reads poetry throughout the songs. It's a wonderful. We have a very different stylistic approach to our classes, but I think it's just a result of finding what inspires you and finding your voice. And I really, really love what he does.
Well, if you'd like to find out more about Derek and what he's doing, I'll have links to his SoundCloud page, as well as OTB Publishing for The Warrior's Path, and of course his own website, derekberes.com. Our guest today, Derek Beres. Derek, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Ted.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.